So here we go. We are jumping into lesson 5. Make sure you have your Why booklet notes. Turn to the page where it says, What about evil? We're going to cover 8 ideas about one of the most significant objections to the Christian faith in the 21st century. Now, we just watched a video asking the question, is God a moral monster? But it indicates several things that we're going to dig into deeper. But before we even jump into this conversation, what I want to say is one of the most significant reasons for the close friends that I have and even the people I know who have turned their back on God is not necessarily because of logical scientific evidence, but because it's this issue right here. And we start with 2 questions as we think about it. How in the world, and this is the question, how in the world could an all-powerful, loving God allow evil in the world? On one hand, if he is all-powerful, he has the capacity to stop anything that is evil, right? So if he's all-powerful, he can stop it. If he is loving, he would want to stop it. So if he's loving and if he's powerful, why in the world is there evil? And so it becomes a logical inconsistency with the revelation of God that we find in Scripture. In Scripture, we find an all-powerful God. In Scripture, we find a loving God. So why is there evil? And that is kind of like a summation in this bottom question. Why is there so much bad in the world? If there's a God, why do all these problems exist? Now, these 2 questions can have a variety of derivatives that we see in our culture. Why would God allow suffering? Why would God allow famine? Why would God allow, and you can go into any number of things, but they become derivatives of really this first and foundational question, how can an all-powerful, loving God allow evil? Now, what I want to say before we jump into this, and I give some reasons, is that the Christian life and accepting a God, and I'm going to get to this even deeper in a second, does require faith. It's not that you need faith to know that God exists, because according to Romans chapter 1, verse 20, his evidence is clearly seen by the things that he has made. We don't necessarily need faith to know that the Bible is a reliable book. We can go and investigate many parts of the Bible to know, yes, not only do we have what's transmitted, but we also can look internally and go, yes, that matches up with the world. But this particular chink in our progression, or this particular conversation, does have an element of faith connected to it. And I would say that's probably true with all of them at some point, regardless of the evidence. You do have to trust that God exists, and you do have to trust that his word is reliable. And so I don't want to negate the fact that there is faith involved, but there are some very concrete things that we can look at that demonstrate how this is not necessarily inconsistent with the world, with the Christian worldview, the fact that God is all-powerful and loving, and that evil still exists in the world. So let's jump into this, one of these more significant objections. Number 1, if there is evil, there must be a God. So atheists often say that the problem of evil is a problem for the Christian or biblical worldview. And while I would say at face value, there may be some logical inconsistencies with going, well, if God is loving, if God is powerful, why would he allow evil? But if you are making that claim, you're making a far more significant claim that totally underwashes or undercuts the concept of atheism, and that is this. If evil exists, then there must be good. If good exists, there must be God. Probably the greatest, if not one of the greatest apologists of the latter half of the 20th century is Ravi Zacharias. And here's his progression here. He says, when you say there is too much evil in the world, you assume that there is good. Because if you're saying there's too much evil, there is a contrast to evil, so you're saying there's good, all right? Number 2, when you assume or make the conclusion that there is good, which you have done by saying that there's too much evil, You are assuming that there is a moral law because you're saying there's too much evil, so there is a better way in which the world should exist. Therefore, you're assuming that there is a moral law. So then he concludes, if you assume that there is a moral law, you must posit a moral law giver. Where did that law come from? The answer is God. And so it's very rational to say, if there is evil, there must be a God. So, if you're an atheist, you have one of two choices. Either you can go the route that some atheists have and say that there is no such thing as evil. We just think there's evil. There's just an opinion of what is good and bad. But in that worldview, you have to say things like the Holocaust, or like a horrific rape, or like genocide that occurs around our world. You have to say that all of those things are not evil. We just think they're evil. And that is a terrible, awful, I would say diabolical worldview. So if we assume that there is evil, there is a God. All right, so number 2, let's go on. A transcendent God, and I was alluding to this, will not be able to be fully understood. I remember several years ago I had been developing some conceptual ideas of God, and I was sharing this with a friend. His name was Grant, and I said, Grant, I came up with this really cool idea. I call it the logical illogicality of the existence of God. And you say, well, what does that mean? Well, first of all, the logical illogicality of the existence of God means that it is logical to assume or come to the conclusion that God exists. So that's logical. And we've actually gone through these earlier in lesson 2, we gave evidences for the existence of God. So is it true that God exists? Not only is it true, it is logical to believe that God exists. Why? Because a design has to have a designer. A cause must have a cause, or a moral law must have a moral law giver. All right, so it's logical to believe God exists. But secondly, if we are believing in a transcendent God, it is also logical to believe that some of the things God does, I will not be able to fully understand. They'll be illogical to me. So what I said to my friend Grant is I said, Grant, it is logical to believe God exists, and because God is a transcendent being, it is also logical to believe that some of the things God does in the world that we occupy will be illogical. And he said, you're wrong. And I said, well, you're a Presbyterian. What do you know? I said, well then Grant, why are, insert laughter there, right? I said, Grant, why am I wrong? And here's what he said. Nothing about the nature or character of God is illogical. But it may seem illogical to me because I'm finite. This is the great danger of a song like Reckless Love. We may, as humans, look at the love of God and in our finite understanding go, God, you have been careless or reckless in the way that you have behaved. But nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, the Bible clearly teaches us that God knew exactly what he was doing, that he was not behaving recklessly on any level, that God was executing a plan that had been in place before the foundation of the world, according to the book of Ephesians. That nothing that God does is illogical or reckless or crazy or foolish, though my finite understanding may look at some of the things God does and go, oh, wow, I cannot comprehend or begin to understand that. But there's a difference. The idea that God is transcendent opens the door for us to believe that some of the things God does, I will not be able to fully understand. And that is a logical conclusion. So point number 2, a transcendent God will not be able to be fully understood. All right, let's go with some more though. Allowing evil and creating evil are different. This is one of the hardest things for specifically Americans to grasp their mind around, or to wrap their mind around, or to grasp. Globally, 90% of the lawsuits occur in the United States. So 90% of every piece of litigation and lawsuits that occur in the world are all happening in the United States. The United States is a very litigious nation. We have lots of attorneys. And oftentimes, lawsuits are all about negating responsibility for the individual. So if I've got a friend that tried a case for a woman that worked in the circus, she was at a Kmart, she slipped and fell, and she sued Kmart because she slipped and fell. Now, whose responsibility is it that she slipped and fell? Well, it could be the responsibility of Kmart because there's water on the ground. But let's step back a little further. What if I can't swim? I don't have the capacity to swim, and I walk by a pool that doesn't have a fence around it. And I don't fall in, because I don't trip and fall in. I actually walk up to the edge, it's a 10-foot deep pool, and I jump in. Whose responsibility is it if I drowned? The answer is mine. Now, you could make the argument, well, if they would have never built a pool, then I would have never drowned. That is true. If the pool would have never been built, then I would have never drowned. That's a logical conclusion. However, and then you could go a step further. The people that built the pool knew that in the world that which we occupy, people that cannot swim exist. And the people that built the pool knew that it was possible that someone who could not swim could interact with the water that they're building. Therefore, the pool builders are responsible for the death. And you can make that argument, but that is neither a just nor logical argument. Just because the pool exists does not necessarily mean that it is the pool builder's fault for them jumping in. And this is the argument we're making. Allowing evil and creating evil are two different things. Just because God put a tree in the garden and told Adam and Eve to not eat of the fruit does not necessarily make God responsible for the choice that Adam and Eve made. Let's go on to number 4. God brings a limit to the effects of evil. Now make sure you're following along in your notes, you're filling these in. God brings a limit to the effects of evil. And let me go to number 5 because we're going to tackle these together. God brings a finality to the devastation of evil. So evil in our culture, in our world, in the world that we give, is not infinite, it is limited, and then ultimately God is going to crush and defeat evil one day. Now, it makes sense that the consequences of an action are felt by a child if we're talking about a child and a parent. So a child violates the law of the parent. It is not unkind for that parent to give consequences to the child for violating the rule that the parent has. In fact, that's even healthy because it helps the child understand that bad actions have consequences, good actions have rewards. And so I'm definitely for reward-based parenting, but at some point there is going to need to be in your parenting some type of consequences that occur. Now, a parent that infinitely executes consequences upon a child is not a good parent. There needs to be a finality to the consequences. And while evil has a negative effect, God has limited the effects of evil. Furthermore, God will crush and ultimately conquer evil one day. One thing that God did to Adam and Eve after they ate the fruit was to kick them out of the garden. And the Bible specifically says why. You say, oh, well, why would God kick them out of the garden? Because there was a second tree in the garden where if they were to eat the fruit from that tree, they would physically continue to live forever. Well, a forever life is a limitless encounter with evil. God has given us the gift of death, which ends the evil in our life. A pastor friend of mine recently, his wife passed away from cancer. I'll never forget as he stood at the opening of his wife's funeral, and he said, Becky has gone from the land of the living, she's gone from the land of the dying into the land of the living. is one of the most beautiful reflections of a biblical worldview, that as Christians, because Jesus has died, we can live also. That the effects of evil are not forever. And if you're walking through difficulty or health difficulties with any person, we know for a fact, we know scripturally, that the effects of evil are not forever. I'm coming up now on the 4th anniversary of a very traumatic injury that I had to my brain. And it has damaged the cranial nerves that control my eye movement and the way that I process light. So in fact, even recording this, what we're recording right now, is actually very, very painful. I was talking with a friend a little while ago, and he asked about some of the prognosis for my progression and my injury. And he asked what the doctor said, and I'll never forget telling him, I mentioned his name, I said, James, I said, it looks like the doctor has said I'm kind of stuck like this forever. In other words, it looks like you've kind of progressed as far as you can, and you're going to have to deal with this. I'll never forget James looking back at me, and he said, Ben, not forever. It was such an encouragement to me and such a scriptural truth that while there is evil in this world, God brings a finality to the devastation of evil, that one day, because of what Jesus did on the cross, my eyes will work appropriately again. And until that day, the truth of His Word and the hope of the gospel is my vision in this life. God brings a finality to the effects of evil, but we continue on. Contrast provides understanding. Contrast provides understanding. We cannot know love without hate. We cannot know peace without turbulence. And we cannot know good without evil. Understand, if you have ever been in a place, like right now, just where you're sitting and watching this, I want you to imagine one of the most peaceful places you have ever experienced in your life. Maybe that is, for my wife, it probably would be getting a massage. Maybe that's going to the beach when you're all alone and the waves are just coming in. Maybe that's up in the mountains, or maybe that's just a place in your house where you shut the door and all the noisy kids are on the other side and you're able to just pause. It's peaceful. When you experience that peace, notice that you understand peace more emphatically, more authentically, to use that term, in a more real way, because you know the opposite of peace, which is turbulence. And while there's a lot of brokenness that has entered into our world, we understand the goodness of God, the love of God, the righteousness of God, these beautiful, incredible characteristics of God far more deeply because of the evil that we have encountered in the world. And so evil has an interesting side to it in which it gives us knowledge, a deeper knowledge of the world that God made. But here's probably the most significant thing about evil, is that God is capable of using evil for a good purpose. Now, here's the conclusion, and sometimes I think Christians get this wrong. God never wants us to pretend like evil is good. In fact, I'm amazed at some of the untrue things about the biblical worldview that some of our Christian music brings out. Some anti-biblical, but there's a song that I encountered years ago called Blessings in Disguise. Now, it is possible that God could bless us and we not realize it. But that is not to say that the evil in this world is somehow God blessing us. It is not a blessing when you get cancer. It is not a blessing when you lose a child to miscarriage. Death is not necessarily a blessing, though God is able to bring a finality to evil. That's not biblical. Pretending like evil is good is not a biblical approach to evil. In fact, anytime we see evil in the Bible, we are supposed to discern it as something that is bad. However, God has a power that transcends even our understanding, so that God is able to use the evil in this world for a good purpose. Let me give you 2 examples. If you've ever had problems with your siblings, you should read the latter half of the book of Genesis where it talks about Joseph. Now, this is significant. Joseph, his brothers, not only threw him in a pit, but literally sold him into slavery. So if you're a young person watching this, trust me, you could have worse siblings. Joseph's brothers sold him into slavery. Years later, after Joseph had saved his entire family's life, he looked at his brothers and his brothers said, "Are you going to have vengeance on him?" Their father Jacob had died. And they're like, "Okay, now that Jacob's dead, are you going to throw us in prison? Are you going to kill us? What are you going to do because we sold you into slavery?" And Joseph, with all his power, looks at his brothers and he said, "You meant it to me for evil." In other words, what you did was an evil act. But he said, "But God used it for good." And what is incredible about the truth of Scripture, or it is incredible about the world that we live in and the God that we have, is that God is able to use the problems in this world for a good purpose. Now, I talked about the brain injury that I've had, and while oftentimes I hate to admit it, there are many good things that God has done, showed himself to me, and even changed my life for the better because of the problem that I deal with every day. Now, if I had a choice, Ben, if you could be healed from your issues with your eyes today, immediately, I would want to be healed immediately, if not sooner. But at the same time, God has used those challenges for good in my life. And lastly, because of all this, we must exercise faith. What we must understand as finite followers of God is that what God is up to is bigger than what we know. It's bigger than us. And so God may be at work and we cannot understand this transcendent God. I love the story of Amy Carmichael and understanding the necessity of trusting the transcendent God. Amy Carmichael grew up in the UK, and as a little girl, she wanted to have blue eyes. She had brown eyes. She asked her mother, she said, "Is God powerful enough to change my eyes from brown to blue?" Well, of course, the answer is yes. God has the power to do that. He created everything. If God wanted to change the color of your eyes, he could do so with just his very voice. And so every night, Amy Carmichael, before she went to bed, would pray that God would change her brown eyes to blue eyes as a little girl. Now, can you imagine how cute that is? And in fact, if you were God listening to the prayers of children as he does, wouldn't you want to change her eyes from brown to blue? She prayed every night, and then the next morning she would wake up and go and look in the mirror. And to her great devastation, her eyes would still be brown. Years later, God called Amy Carmichael to be a missionary to the nation of India. What she discovered was that in some of the temples, there were young women who were being sexually trafficked in the back parts of these temples. And so what she did, being a white woman from the UK, is she took tea and coffee grinds and rubbed them on her skin to give her a darker appearance so that she could sneak into these temples. And so she changed the color of her skin, her face, and everything with the coffee and tea grinds, and would sneak into these temples and sneak these young women out, rescuing them from what we call today human or sexual trafficking that was occurring in the temples of India. And Amy Carmichael said this: "As a child, I prayed that God would change the colors of my eyes. But if God would have changed my eyes from brown to blue, that they would have stopped me at the very gates of the temple, and I would have never gotten in to do the work that he called me to do." I can promise you, if you're going through something difficult right now, you may not understand how God can use the hurt, God can use the pain, God can use the evil of this world for his good purpose, if you are willing to trust him. Because I do believe that one day, as I love the old spiritual song, Farther Along, that one day we will be able to look back and say, "Oh God, I realize what you are doing. God, you were at work in ways that I could not even comprehend. God, you are at work. If you'd like more information from the Center for Truth and Love, I challenge you for a free resource to text the word prepared to the number 33777. You can also go to our website and find more videos on this problem. Why would God allow evil into the world? Just check out our Curious Conversations. I'm Ben Schettler for the Center for Truth and Love, and also for Olive Baptist Church, covering this very important topic of how do I lovingly, carefully, and kindly speak the truth in love, always being ready to give an answer that's so compelling that people are ashamed when they challenge the truth of Scripture. I hope that you will confidently and lovingly speak God's truth in love.